Tom Quiggin, thank you very much for coming out to do this. I know that these are what the Chinese might call interesting times in Canada. And maybe you could just start by telling us a tiny bit about yourself and your background, and then we'll get on to what's going on.
Well, I'm ex-military. I spent 15 years in the Canadian Forces, the majority of that in the intelligence world, where I got to travel to exciting places like Bosnia and Croatia during the war, northern Albania. I was also doing arms control work in Russia, Poland, Belarus, and other areas like that. Following that, I worked for something called the Intelligence Assessment Secretariat, which few people have heard of. It is actually that intelligence section of the Canadian government that reports directly to the Prime Minister and the Cabinet. I also worked for about 6.5 years or so for the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, doing intelligence supports to investigations for them, but within the context of national security, which is essentially terrorism, as well as investigations into judges and politicians, that sort of thing. Somewhere along the line, I spent some time in Singapore at Nanyang Technological University, where I was doing an intelligence research project there, and I worked for the International War Crimes Tribunal in the former Yugoslavia as well. So, I mean, at the end of the day, I guess I'm sort of a systems guy. I'm pretty much a product of the system, right down to the fact that my master's degree was paid for by the military at one point. So.
Wow, well that's, I think that takes you well and clearly away from the tinfoil hat category. So I know that you wrote a book recently. Can you tell us just a little bit about that?
Yeah, I've written a couple of books. One was on intelligence when I was in Singapore. The other one that just came out recently was called Submission, The Danger of Political Islam to Canada. I wrote that with Tahir Gora and Saeed Shoaib and Jonathan Kotler, and Rahil Reza was kind enough to do the introduction for us. And it's a look basically at how Islamists, that is to say the folks who follow a political version of Islam, how they've infiltrated government and other systems in Canada, and how they're both attempting to influence policy in Canada in their favor, as well as using Canada as an ATM essentially for terrorism fundraising.
And I think that sounds like a good jumping off point, using Canada as an ATM. I understand that you have initiated a specific action against the government based on, well, if I understand this right, because the government's blatantly breaking its own laws on funding terror. Do I have that right, or can you straighten me out on that?
Well, I think you've essentially hit it there. What's happening and what's changed in just the last few years is the nature of terrorism funding in Canada. Charitable groups in Canada have been used for the last 20 years or more to do terrorism fundraising. And this isn't my opinion. This is the view of the Canada Revenue Agency, CRA, for instance. They pulled the charitable status from something called IRFAN, the International Relief Fund for the Afflicted and Needy, because it was sending money directly to Hamas, which of course is a listed terrorist group in Canada. The Islamic Society of North America, for instance, has been busted twice for terrorism funding and have lost charitable status in that case. Just for fun, it's also worth mentioning we had something here in Canada called the World Islamic Call Society. That was a federally registered charity that was issuing tax receipts to Canadians. The money in the organization behind this, though, was actually Muammar Gaddafi of Libya, and it was his jihad fund operating in Canada. And I'm not making that up. It was literally called the Jihad Fund. So this has been going on for years. So what's happening to a certain degree is no surprise. What has changed in the last 3 years, however, and this is the point of the submission and the request for an investigation I've made to the RCMP, is that members of the government now are directing money to federally registered charities. They know this money goes down a path to a point where some of that money will wind up funding extremism and terrorism. So Islamic Relief Canada is the recipient of money from multiple different government programs, such as the Summer Job Program, Foreign Aid, the M103 Islamophobia money, and all that sort of stuff. Islamic Relief Canada, according to its own financial documents repeatedly over a series of years, sends money to their parent organization called Islamic Relief Worldwide. Now, Islamic Relief Worldwide has been identified by a variety of organizations as sending their money to fund terrorism and extremism. So why would we say that? Well, the country of Bangladesh has banned Islamic Relief Worldwide from operating in the area because they believe Islamic Relief Worldwide is funding extremism. The country of the United Arab Emirates has identified Islamic Relief Worldwide and Islamic Relief United Kingdom as being a terrorism funding outfit as well as being a front group for the Muslim Brotherhood. The government of Israel has identified Islamic Relief Worldwide as funding Hamas. Then if you move out of the sort of like, shall we say, national domain and move into the financial domain, HSBC, which is one of the world's largest banks, has taken Islamic Relief accounts and closed them. And they said publicly, because they're worried about terrorism funding regulations. UBS is a very large, well-known Swiss bank, and they did the same thing. They've cut their relationship with Islamic Relief. And again, they quote, funding terrorism is a problem. Here in Canada, the Financial Post used to have Islamic Relief Canada listed as one of Canada's top 25 charities. And a couple of years ago, they pulled the thing off the list and said, you know what, there's some terrorism funding concerns here we're not quite clear on, so we're stopping it. And then Britain's Charity Overwatch, which watches charities to make sure they're being good, kind of a thing, has pulled Islamic Relief Worldwide off, again quoting terrorism funding concerns. And the Charity Overwatch actually points out there are 4,000 charities they have in the United Kingdom which have ties to the Islamic community. But they said this one stands out so bad it's been cut.
Can I stop you for 1 second just to roll the tape back to this? You mentioned funding and you mentioned M103, and I think for the sake of an international audience or even a lot of Canadians who just simply don't get this yet. Now correct me if I'm wrong on this point form, but it seems to me that Trudeau did something which is probably unprecedented in Canadian history, which is he had a motion passed which was to quell freedom of speech in specific areas, namely criticism of Islam, and then instead of actually continuing forward after a set of hearings to make it into an official law, instead just funded its enforcement, skipping the legislative process where you actually have a law, and put, I think, I don't know, 25 million or some large sum of money into actually enforcing the notions behind the motion. And so when you're talking about, when you mentioned M103 in the context of funding these groups, are you saying that these monies were funneled through that fund to these groups?
Okay, just for your international audience, it's worth noting Canada has something called the M103 Islamophobia motion. It was put into the House of Parliament by Iqra Khalid, a member of Parliament from Mississauga, who was originally born in Pakistan. Both she and her father Hafiz had very close ties to the Islamic Society of North America, which we already mentioned got in trouble for funding terrorism. This motion claimed to be just sort of an anti-hate speech kind of thing, but very clearly it was aimed at quelling any criticism of Islamists, that is to say political Islam. That was the target. And it's worth noting that Iqra Khalid, in her own writings, and again, this isn't me saying this is Iqra Khalid saying this, she identifies as a supporter of Sharia law, and she self-identifies as a Salafist, which I think is quite serious. Now, you're right about the motion went through Parliament. It went through a series of hearings. And then something rather strange has happened, as you pointed out. There is no actual law to be enforced yet, so to call it enforcement is a bit of a reach. But Iqra Khalid just announced, and she was taped saying this, that the government's going to give $23 million to anti-Islamophobia projects in Canada, which says, I mean, that's a rather large amount of money, and it's going to a couple of rather questionable sources, including Islamic Relief Canada. And this is believed to be used to silence criticism of the Islamists through whether it's social media, through the newspapers, through campaigns to force people into silence. So rather than taking the sort of hard-edged legal approach, they're taking a softer edge social approach to try and silence criticism of Islam. Whether it continues to become law or not is something I think we have to wait to see yet.
It seems to me they might have more flexibility by not making it law. So tell me, now you mentioned also that you said this action that you've launched to the RCMP. What exactly was that?
Okay, so I took a look at Islamic Relief Canada and why they've been getting so much money so quickly from the government of Canada in the last few years. And it turns out, as I mentioned, they're getting a bunch of different money into them through Foreign Affairs, or I guess we're supposed to call it Global Affairs Canada now. They've been getting money from Global Affairs Canada. They've been getting money from the Ministry of International Development. They've been getting money through the M103 project, and they've been getting money through Citizenship and Immigration. It's also worth noting that Prime Minister Trudeau has done 2 promotional videos since he's been Prime Minister, One of them was for Islamic Relief Canada. So he's been lending the prestige of the Prime Minister to Islamic Relief Canada. And then Omar El-Gabra, another member of Parliament from Mississauga, has done the same thing. He's risen in the House of Commons to make a speech about what a great bunch of guys Islamic Relief Canada are, and he's gone to their various fundraising events in his capacity as a member of Parliament, again lending the prestige of Parliament to doing fundraising for these folks. So it struck me as rather strange. I'd never actually seen this before, where the government of Canada will use taxpayers' money through ministerial programs to send money to an organization, that is to say Islamic Relief Canada, which they know is going down the path to fund extremism and terrorism in various parts of the world. Now, governments have been sloppy in the past, they've done some strange things, but I've never seen anybody consistently and deliberately fund an organization which is under such question around the world. Also worth noting that since I sent my official complaint to the RCMP, asking them to investigate this, the 7 members of Congress in the United States have also sent a letter to the IRS, to the FBI, asking that Islamic Relief USA be investigated for much the same reason I did. And it's also worth noting, just for fun, that I'm a court expert on terrorism. That has been recognized by the Ontario Superior Court, which is a criminal court, and by the Federal Court of Canada, which is a civil court. But just worth noting that the first time I was recognized as a court expert on jihadist-based terrorism was while I was working for the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. So it'll be interesting to see how seriously take this complaint I've put forward. What I've actually done formally is I sent them a 132-page paper. 20 pages of it, the first 20 pages, were the actual complaint listing the amount of money, who sent it, when, where it went, all that sort of stuff, pointing out the various people that have identified this as money going the path to terrorism. And then the other 110 pages or so was background information, supporting annexes. It was also information defining how we assess sources. So of course people always say, oh, well, you know, nobody actually believes this, or it's not true, you got it off the internet. Every footnote I put into a paper is assessed individually, and it's assessed for 2 different things. It's assessed for source reliability, so you look at the actual source itself and say, does this source measure up as a valid source to be talking on this kind of subject? And then you reassess it again for information credibility to see whether the information itself is credible, notwithstanding whether the source itself is reliable or not. So there's also a section in the paper that describes how we do that. So everything that is in this 132-page paper has been assessed to a level where I would be happy to walk into the Federal Court of Canada and use this as evidence, because that's the standard to which it was prepared.
Well, I hope we get to that. This might be a good moment to mention Trudeau's newest peculiar move, which is asking the banks to submit the complete financial records attached to the names of the people to whom they belong without their knowledge or consent. I think 500,000 to the government through Statistics Canada. And I think even the banks are scratching their heads over this, wondering whether or not they have to or will comply. I don't even know if our Constitution has anything like a 4th Amendment which would make it clear that you just can't do that. But do you think this is in any way consistent with the government's other actions concerning?
It is unfortunately consistent with the sort of general pattern that we've seen. It's worth taking a step back here on a couple of things. The first is Trudeau himself. He self-identifies, and again, what I'm about to say here is not my opinion of Trudeau, it's Trudeau's own statements about himself. He identifies as a globalist. He identifies as a post-nationalist and says we're the world's first post-national state.
To the New York Times.
Yeah, and he says it to major media outfits around the world. It's not like he's shy about this. He also says he doesn't believe in Canadian values. He doesn't believe in what he calls European values, which would be the founding values of Canada, which are the French and the English. At the end of the day, I mean, if we look at those, what those are Judeo-Christian values, and this is what has shaped most of the West and what has shaped most of Canada. He openly opposes those values. He actually ran for Parliament. Very few people paid attention to him, which is unfortunate. But he actually ran for Parliament saying he'd have a special immigration program for Muslims and Arabs. And if you recall, he was the guy who during a very friendly meeting in a liberal friendly environment was asked a very simple question, and it was words to the effect of, if you weren't in Canada, which country would you most like to live in, or which country would you most like to emulate? I mean, that is a throwaway question that politicians get. And he actually said he admired the country of China because of its ability to turn on a dime with respect to policy. And I was utterly shocked by that because there are a couple of things you can admire China for if you're looking for compliments. China feeds its population, which for several hundred years they had. Millions of people were dying in China from revolution, from famine, whatever. So China's done that. China has sort of an economic miracle, and you can kind of admire that despite the fact it's built on a lot of crushed bones. But
Trudeau's actual words were he admired their basic dictators.
Yes, and he also used the word the basic dictatorship and its ability to turn on a dime. And I was just utterly shocked by that he would admire China for its government, which is like a flat-out, hardcore dictatorship. There's no other way of describing that government. Maybe politely you could call it an oligarchy, but with the recent changes over there, it's pretty much a presidency of one person. So putting all of that together, this is a guy who is not in favor of the Westphalian state system. He does not like the Westminster system of parliament we have, where he says he views himself as a ceremonial leader. Well, I mean, if you want to be ceremonial about your leadership, great, become the Governor General, which is why we have the Governor General. But you're the chief executive officer of the government. You're the prime minister. You are the first amongst equals. So the other thing that's worth stepping back also just before we address the question directly is to say, when Harper was prime minister, he caused no end of upset with a lot of people by getting rid of the census, the long form of the census, and he was not exactly what one might call too favorable to Statistics Canada. He thought they were collecting too much data on Canadians and thought most of it was unnecessary. So along comes Mr. Trudeau and goes back the opposite direction, and they actually empower Statistics Canada to collect more information as part of his view that the government should be able to reach into every aspect of your being, every aspect of your life. So now all of a sudden we have, as you say, the Statistics Canada program, which will collect the name, address, bank account number, checking account number, ATM actions, everything possible from the bank. They're going to do this to 500,000 Canadians a year and keep doing it year after year after year. This is not completely unheard of. It's not totally shocking. And one of the countries using a system like this is China, where they now have kind of a social credit rating system. So most Canadians are familiar with the idea of a credit rating. If you pay your credit card and you pay your car loan and you pay your mortgage, you're a good person and your rating goes up. If you decide to not pay your bills, your rating goes down. China has now taken this to a whole new level, and they have a social system. So if you're caught jaywalking, your score goes down. If you fail an exam at university, your score goes down. If you're convicted of a criminal offense, your score goes down.
If you hold the wrong opinion.
If you're caught on a website expressing negative views about the government of China, your score goes down. Now, if you pay your bills on time, you go to the right school, you say the right thing, your score goes up. Now, what's terrifying about the Chinese system is you can be refused a train ticket for travel within China. You can be refused airline tickets. Your children won't get to go to the right schools. Your children won't get the right jobs, and you're not going to get the right job if you don't have the right social score. So ironically enough, now on dating websites in China, some people are starting to put their social score because it shows they're in tight with the government and they're good people. So when you look at what Canada is doing by collecting everything about 500,000 citizens, it's terrifying. And why I would say it's terrifying and not just business is the fact that they want your name, your address, and everything that goes with the data. If this was an innocent program to look at the financial health of Canada, or if it was an innocent program to track how we use credit cards or how we use home equity line of credits or how we buy cars, that would be fine. The data could be anonymized. In other words, they could take away the name, the address, and all that sort of stuff, the birth date, and leave just what we call the metadata. Lots of folks do that. The health people do this all the time. They get hospital records on sick people, but the name, the address, the date of birth, and everything is taken away. And that way researchers can deal with just the raw data about who's sick, who's healthy, what drugs work, what drugs don't. So if Statistics Canada was doing that, if they were just taking metadata I would say, well, it's a little intrusive, but, whatever, okay. But the fact that they want your name, your address, your phone number, your date of birth, to me speaks of a greater program. And I don't know if people have been watching, but also since Mr. Trudeau became Prime Minister, the way our revenue service works has changed as well. CRA, for instance, says, oh no, there's been no changes, nothing going on here, keep on moving, nothing to see. But yet people who are diabetic, who've been claiming deductions for years based on their medical costs, all of a sudden collectively, they all found out at the same time that this stops. In other words, more money to be paid by diabetics. Same thing with folks who have autistic children. For years, they were able to claim certain expenses against the cost of having an autistic child, and all of a sudden it all stopped at once. CRA says, no, nothing to see, just move along, nothing happening here. But yet finally they're forced to admit that, yeah, there is something happening here. So what is happening here in Canada and around...
The IRS under Obama, isn't it?
There is, unfortunately, some reflections there that the IRS can be weaponized in the United States. In fact, it was. It was weaponized against opponents of Obama. And again, not my opinion. This is actual court cases which have shown that people were targeted. Yep. This is people were targeted specifically because they spoke out against Obama. And the next thing you know, they found themselves under years of audits. So unfortunately, what we're seeing around the world is, and most people should realize this, but they don't, the governments are going broke, plain and simple. The government wants more and more programs to sort of interfere with your life, control what you eat and everything else. And this all costs money. And unfortunately, you look at the province of Ontario now, just by itself, is the world's largest non-sovereign debtor. We're shaped in California, and that's saying something. The government of Canada is sliding massively into debt. The American government is $21 trillion in debt, and it just goes on and on and on. So governments are looking for new ways to raise money, and tracking people's individual lives, every nickel they spend everywhere they go, is one way of doing it, saying, aha, we caught $100 coming into your bank account which you didn't declare. We're now going to say that was income. Whether it was or not is not important. We're just going to say it's income, and you're going to have to pay tax on it unless you want to hire an accountant, spend $20,000 or so and prove that it wasn't. Now, separate from all of this, there's something else going on that folks aren't paying attention to, and it's kind of fun. Shared Services Canada was given a mandate to take all of the government's data centers and crush them down to a much smaller number. And according to Shared Services' own data, and again, this is their information, they're going to go from 487 data centers across Canada to 7. And think about that for a second. Every bit of data the government has on anything or anybody, and that's Ministry of Transport, DND, RCMP, Health Canada, CRA, you name it, will all be compressed into 7 data centers, of which they will have overlapping capabilities. So in reality, all of the government's data can be found on 3 different data centers because they overlap for purposes of redundancy. Here's the issue. Statistics Canada says, trust us, everything's okay. We're going to protect your data even though we've got highly sensitive data about you. We promise not to share it with anybody. Well, it's going to be co-located in the same server farm as everything else. And if anybody's gone back to look at Shared Services, Statistics Canada, or CRA, they'll find just a whole series of violations of security, data loss, intrusions. I just happen to be personally aware of one issue where CRA, where one of their techs was in a server room one day and actually found a little red blinking light on a box on the top of the server and went, wow, I don't know what that is, and I don't know how it got in here. Anyway, it turns out a private company had come in, installed a monitor on the server to see how much power it was using and how much data it was using, and then was transferring that data remotely. So there you go. I mean, everybody says their servers are secure and they take all the good care, but it's absolute nonsense. I mean, Facebook has lost millions. Various airlines have lost tens of millions of accounts. Anytime you concentrate data in one place, it's that much easier for the bad guys to go after it.
And even, Stratfor, which prides itself on as a security information company, they had their database hacked, and all of their members' private emails, information, credit card numbers were sent out to bad guys.
Yeah, I had a company I was working with at the time that had a particular involvement in that one. What Stratfor did, which a lot of companies do, it's illegal, but they all do it anyway, is if you subscribe to a service anywhere, doesn't matter whether it's Amazon or Stratfor or iTunes or whatever, you buy a ticket from Via Rail Canada or Air Canada, whatever. You give them your credit card number, and then you type in that little 3-digit or 4-digit number in the back of your card, what the companies are supposed to do is save that on 2 separate servers. So if they do get hacked, one server might lose all the card numbers, but at least it doesn't have all the security digits to go with it. Well, guess what? Most companies don't do that. And when I say most companies, I mean most companies don't actually follow the law. They save it all on one server. So if you hack the server, you get not only the person's credit card number, all their personal data, you also get the 3 or 4-digit security number. So yeah, there's another just a little reason to, just be careful with what you've got out there. If you're going to use a credit card online, sometimes it's not a bad idea to get a separate credit card to do that. Keep the balance, keep the credit limit on it rather low. So if something does go wrong and your card number is hacked or lost or whatever, at least the damage is relatively minimal.
That's great advice. So I think basically where we are is that we have a government which appears to be taking actions which are consistent with its stated views about the destruction of the individual, the nation state. What you could almost say sounds like socialism.
It is a combination of a sort of socialist ideal. It is also a sort of cultural socialism, otherwise known as cultural Marxism. And yeah, there are people like Trudeau, like Jean-Claude Juncker, who's head of the European Union, and a variety of other people who actually argue what the world needs is no borders. And their sort of working theory is if there were no borders, everybody could just move around and be where they want to be, and they could share what they want to share. And if there was work over here, people could just move there. And wouldn't it be wonderful? We all just had one big fluid community. And it's an interesting ideal, and on paper, it actually sounds quite wonderful. The downside of it, of course, is the planet is populated by human beings, and they will take advantage of whatever system they want. So if you choose to go to an open border system, which is what Mr. Trudeau is arguing in favor of, and in what we're doing in practice is an open border system, unlike America right now, which is moving in the opposite direction. What you wind up with is the people who tend to move quite often are people who are looking for the free ride or they're in trouble at home. In other words, they're not migrants who want to come to Canada who say, my home country sucks, I'm oppressed, I want to go to Canada and work because I'm a skilled carpenter, a skilled technician, whatever. What they're saying is, oh, I'm in trouble at home. Chances are the trouble is sometimes their own making, i.e. they belong to a terrorist group or a criminal group or something, and they want to come to Canada for the free ride. So the sort of Trudeaus and Jean-Claude Junckers of the world would argue that if you get rid of borders, then you get rid of border wars. You get rid of international war, wouldn't that be great? Of course, what you wind up with is wars between neighborhoods rather than wars between countries. And if you'd like to see an example of that, look at Paris, look at Brussels, look at Sweden, et cetera, et cetera. Increasingly, you can look at parts of Toronto, parts of Vancouver, parts of Edmonton, where Canada used to be about integration rather than diversity. So when I went to York University in 1989 and 1990, I would go with my Indian friend into Little India, or we'd go into Little China or Chinatown, and nobody ever looked at us strange. Maybe in Chinatown, if you went into the Chinese language only restaurants, they'd look at you a bit weird as though like, hey, round eyes, are you like lost? But you're never treated with hostility. It was always just, okay, come on in, round eyes, your money's green, it's all good, not a problem. Now, if you walk through certain parts of Toronto, you're looked at with hostility because you don't belong in that neighborhood. And that's a feeling that the first time I experienced that was in the Netherlands in 2000, but now I'm seeing it in Canada, where you're not wanted in certain neighborhoods based on skin color, religion, background, whatever. So yeah, it's kind of getting to be a problem in a lot of places. The other problem with an open border system is you can have open borders or you can have a welfare state, but you can't have both. If you have a welfare state where people are able to get services based on other people's labor, like free healthcare, free education, this sort of stuff, you're going to have a whole lot of people move in to take advantage of the free goods, but they're not going to want to contribute to the actual earning system. So at the end of the day, your welfare system winds up supporting more and more and more people. And of course, we're already in trouble in a variety of provinces, Ontario being the best example, which are close to going broke. New Brunswick and Newfoundland are already borderline broke. If they were businesses, they'd have gone under years ago. And we're now looking at a situation where people are starting to look at what is it going to cost to bail out New Brunswick, what's it going to cost to bail out Newfoundland, and increasingly, if there is a sharp spike in interest rates, then we're going to be looking, what does it cost to bail out Ontario, which would have been unthinkable 15 years ago because Ontario was the engine of the economy.
Just to go back for about a minute here, it's also interesting that in a border-free world, what you also end up with is exponentially more borders. And if you go around Paris, you discover there's a border around the Eiffel Tower. There's a border around the Louvre. There's a border around every cultural landmark of importance to one group of people that in fact are held in contempt by another group of people that claim equal or greater rights on that territory. So suddenly you notice that where there's no borders in France, there's now hundreds and soon thousands of borders, and they'll be absolutely necessary if you have any intention of preserving those items of importance from those who have fundamentally different views.
Yeah, one of the great ironies of the current world is Trump is talking about building a wall with Mexico. Whether he ever does or not is another question. But he's talking about it. And of course, people are violently opposed to his idea, saying that walls represent fascism and walls represent whatever. It's ironic to note that, of course, the Pope, who opposes this, lives in a walled city where he has his own mercenary army to protect him. And it's literally a mercenary army. They have a Swiss guard. They're paid mercenaries whose job it is to protect the Pope. And they're a very significant force, by the way. You mentioned the Louvre and the Eiffel Tower both have walls built around them to protect them.
Recently.
Yes, just recently. More interesting, we have people like Zuckerberg, the head of Facebook, who violently opposes Trump, but at the same time, he bought a new house, bought several houses around him, had them all destroyed, and then built a wall around his own little compound. And now he's doing the same thing in Hawaii in his own property. He is banning people from moving across his property to the beach, where the indigenous Hawaiians say, hang on just a second, we have the right of movement on Hawaiian land because we've been here like forever. But Zuckerberg doesn't want them, so he's saying they're not allowed to move across his land. So it's ironic the people who are most heavily opposed to things like border walls are the people who build their own substantial walls around them to protect themselves. This is like the George Clooney's of the world. These are people who have money that can afford this. We look at Mayor John Tory, I think, is another sort of example of where you go with this kind of thing. John Tory says, you know, there's no reason for anybody in Toronto to ever have a handgun. Except, of course, John Tory moves around with a secure detachment of police who carry handguns. So it becomes this sort of security for me, but not for thee kind of approach. And I think for folks who live in poorer neighborhoods, folks who live with less money, folks who don't have armed mercenary forces to protect them, they're starting to see the effects of this. Whereas the so-called policymakers and the leading thinkers or the IYIs, the intellectual yet idiot kind of people that we have in a lot of senior positions, because they're well protected, they look around and say, that's not really a problem. I don't see crime in my neighborhood. And of course, well, you don't. You have armed guards. Most of us don't.
Yeah, I think this is the socialist elitist model going back from day one. Do you see any movement on your I guess would you say the charges that you have filed? Is there any movement? What do you think the chances of success of even an investigation taking place by the RCMP? And have you seen any movement since you initially?
Okay, just a bit of background here. What I did, as we discussed, is I filed a 132-page paper with them outlining what would actually be called a will say. In other words, this is what I would say if I was in court, hypothetically speaking. And I said, based on this information, I think the Commissioner of the RCMP should order an investigation into whether the Government of Canada is or is not funding terrorism by sending money down a certain path. Now, first thing, the RCMP, by law, has to investigate every criminal complaint by a citizen. Now, the next question is how much effort do they put into it is another question. So just by example, when I worked for the RCMP, we would sometimes get war crimes complaints and say, so-and-so who lives at this address is a war criminal. And I know this because he has 2 large German Shepherds. So you look at it and say, well, that's not exactly evidence. So we do a name check, we do a background check, see if this person is wanted anywhere, and then the file would be closed. Grand total amount of work into the file, maybe an hour. So the RCMP required by law to open a file. So when I sent my complaint to the RCMP, I got an email back within 3 hours that basically said, dear sir, we have your email, we'll look at it. Then about 13 or 14 days later, I got a very politely, very professional email from a person who works for the Commissioner of the RCMP saying, we're looking into it. We've sent it down to the appropriate business line, they call it, which tells me there's something wrong with the government when the RCMP has business lines. But anyway, but nonetheless, they say they've opened a file and they provided a file number. So they have it at a minimum followed the law, gone ahead and opened the file. Now, to what extent they will actually investigate, of course, is a problem. And I'm aware of this. I've essentially taken a loaded hand grenade, handed it to the RCMP and said, here you go. Because the political implications of this are quite serious. But having said that, I'm a court expert on terrorism. The Federal Court of Canada also recognized my expertise in the collection of intelligence and evidence. And again, I've written everything to a level that it would reach the standards which are expected by the Civil Court of Canada, albeit not necessarily criminal court. So do I expect anything to happen at the end of the day? Probably not. I think at the end of the day, they'll just bury the investigation or, make it go away through time or something like that. But I think it's worth putting out there on the record that the government of Canada is knowingly funding terrorism down several different lines. What's not in my report, and it would be something other folks should be looking at, is UNRWA, the United Nations, so-called United Nations organization that's responsible for activities in Gaza and the West Bank. A lot of other countries, including Saudi Arabia and America, pulled funding to UNRWA because they say at the end of the day, a whole lot of the money and the effort winds up in the hands of Hamas. And the schools at the UNRWA actually teaches, suicide bombers are good, you should kill all the Jews and all that sort of stuff. So while other countries are gradually backing away from UNRWA, Canada's doubled down, and we've now sent, I think it's a grand total of about $160 million to these folks. Arguably, that again is funding an organization which is known to be incredibly dodgy. So again, not part of my complaint, but it's just part of something else that's going on out there.
Is it fair to say then that at worst, you will have demonstrated that the Canadian government is structured in such a way is that if you provide court-level evidence from a court-level person in terms of vetted for this sort of thing, that we can now at least show that the system is set up in such a way that there is no fairness, that there's no accountability by government?
If you'd asked me that question 10 years ago, I would have rejected the question on principle and said, no, the system is a little sloppy and it's a little slow and it's a little awkward and it stumbles and it falls, but at the end of the day, it works. You just have to give it time. Now I'm not so sure. When people ask me, is it a good idea to launch a complaint like this? The answer is, well, no, it's not. You're upsetting two groups of people. One is the government of Canada. The other is Islamic Relief. In terms of fear, people have asked me, are you afraid of doing this? And I said, well, I'm not stupid. I worked for police forces and intelligence agencies for years. I've served in a war zone. I understand the idea of violence. And I understand how government can crush you without violence. But if you were to ask me, which one do I fear the most? Would I fear the Islamist groups whom I'm attacking through this, or do I fear the government of Canada? I'd say it's about 51-49, and I fear the government more than I fear the Islamists. Again, if we'd raised this issue 10 years ago, I would have rejected it, but things have changed, and I would argue not in a positive direction.